Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is how I built Eduard's 148 Pfalz D.III.A. in the markings of Max Holtzem. The kit dates back to 1999, at the time Eduard were really beginning to up their game. Mouldings were sharp, and although some detail was rather basic, a fret of Photo-Etch was included to offset this. Aftermarket included Quinta Studios and Peddinghaus Decals. There were a lot of simulated wood components in the build. The process began with a flat coat of Tamiya buff, followed by some streaking with a coarse brush. The rougher the better. This can then be brushed out with a softer brush to produce a more in-scale appearance. Then I left these parts for a couple of days for the oils to completely dry. Then oversprayed them with a Tamiya clear orange, which gives the wood tones a nice rich hue. I wanted to add a little bit of shading around the interior framework, so the structure was first masked with 0.7mm tape. Tedious, but not difficult. A darker brown shade was then sprayed along the edges to create some subtle depth and shadow. AK's extreme metal was used on some parts. It's the first time I've sprayed it and I was impressed. I absolutely loathe Photo-Etch, but there's no doubt it does add another level of detail, such as on these rudder pedals. Eduard did a pretty good job of replicating the Mercedes D.III engine. To facilitate painting the aluminium coloured base and the black upper cylinders, the engine was first cut into two parts. Did I mention I loathe Photo-Etch? So much so that I decided to spend 5 hours designing and 3D printing some replacement Spandaus, rather than bend the kit's Photo-Etch jackets into shape. It was at this stage, after a discussion with World War I historian Stephen Lawson, that I realised the interior colour was most likely the same silver grey as the exterior, with light green framing. So the wood effect had to be stripped completely using Tamiya lacquer thinner. 50 years of modelling and I still haven't learned to do my research before starting the model. Quinta Studio's seat cushion and harness were superb, so well printed and easy to use it felt almost like cheating. The instrument panel was lovely too. However, I did omit some of their wood effect decals in favour of the oil technique, which was a bit more subdued and realistic looking, in my opinion. And so, with the cockpit completed and the engine in place, the fuselage hearts were glued and clamped. While that was all curing, the wings were detached from the sprues and the moulding seams cleaned up. There was minimal sanding and filling needed on the fuselage, thanks to the excellent engineering. I drilled out the rivets around the engine for some visual interest. Photos of the real aircraft show folds or sections in the cockpit coaming, so these were simulated with darker brown applied with a fine brush, followed by a lighter shade to replicate highlights. Eduard incorrectly moulded the fuel tank on top of the upper wing, whereas in reality it was below the wing surface, and so it had to be sanded off. The delineation of the ailerons was quite shallow, so these were re-engraved to hold a wash. Planning ahead for painting, the cockpit and engine were masked off with parafilm. I used silicone-tipped shaper brushes to push the film into tight corners. Almost time for paint. First step was to clean the model with Tester's plastic prep and a soft brush. I decanted some Tamiya white primer and applied that as a base. This was followed by a few coats of Tamiya X2 gloss white on the lower wings and rear fuselage where I knew the decals would be applied. Looking ahead now to the rigging process, which required drilling holes for the wires. I used tape as a guide to ensure everything was symmetrical. Drilling tiny holes in plastic leaves a surprising amount of debris, which had to be thoroughly cleaned off before going any further. This scheme required an insane amount of masking, especially once I decided to paint many of the markings. Artwork was created in Adobe Illustrator, then sent to a Cricut cutter to create the self-adhesive masks. All of the white markings had to be masked first. The radiator above and below the upper wing was sprayed with AK aluminium and then masked with parafilm. Tamiya Gloss Black was airbrushed next over the whole airframe. Thinned with Gunzy self-leveling thinner, it can be sprayed in fairly wet coats which will dry to a nice smooth gloss. I quite often use a warm hairdryer to accelerate the drying time. Time for more masks, this time for the black markings. The rear fuselage decoration required applying masks for both the black and the silver stripes to ensure consistent spacing. Every other mask was then removed. After covering the black tail section with parafilm, the main silver-grey airframe colour could be applied. I mixed this from a Tamiya lacquer silver and a Mr. Hobby lacquer light grey. I'm not sure if there was some incompatibility with the two lacquers, but I could not get the mixture to go down smoothly, even after adjusting the paint and thinner ratios several times. It just went on really speckly. Also, looking at it now, I think the paint mix should have been more grey and less silver, although the final satin coat did help mute that a bit. For me, peeling the masks off is one of the most satisfying modelling stages, and this went better than expected. There was definitely some touch-up required, but overall the colour scheme was starting to come together. I thought it might add some visual interest to show the wing's rib structure on the underside of the top wing. Masking tape was applied to the rib positions, wing spars and the whole centre section. A few coats of the silver grey mix followed. Once the tape was removed, the contrast was obviously much too stark, but a few more coats of silver toned it all down. Most of the Pfalz access panels around the engine were light green, so I masked and airbrushed them along with the mounting brackets on the struts. A dark brown oil wash was applied to the very few panel lines and the louvres on the wing radiator, and the excess later wiped off. The lozenge decals were next. I painted the wings gloss white because the Quinta Studio's lozenges have no white backing, so they're basically translucent. With lots of microset, the decals settle down perfectly. Because they're transparent though, any slight overlap of the sections will show up as a dark edge. After everything was completely dry, I gloss coated a few times to seal them. While the lower wings were fully curing, I began applying some of the other decals which I'd previously printed on my colour laser. Quinta's rib tapes are three-dimensional. There's actually raised stitching on each one, but as a result they're quite thick. Applying these was definitely a challenge, getting them to line up and stay straight, as well as to wrap tightly around the leading edge. To be honest, I'd gladly have sacrificed the three-dimensional aspect for some regular screen-printed decals, although I have to say the colours do look great. The ends of the overhanging tapes were trimmed with a sharp blade when they were all dry. Painting the white crosses on the wing undersides was nerve-wracking, as I was afraid the masks would pull up the lozenge decals. Fortunately they didn't, but quite a bit of white paint bled underneath them. This AK flexible stencil is really handy for applying random organic weathering effects. The other decals could now be applied. I had decided to print the black elements as decals rather than mask and spray them, feeling it would be quicker and easier to align decals. The distinctive comet marking on Holtzem's Pfalz represents his guardian angel, in this case his mother, who died when he was 9 years old. Almost as good as peeling off masks is spraying a flat finish over a gloss model. It's like magic watching many of the tiny flaws disappear before my eyes. Not all of them, unfortunately, but the model always looks so much better. It also provides a good surface for the next stage. I decided to do a little more weathering using oils, mostly around the engine area where general filth would accumulate anyway. The various colours were squeezed onto a piece of thick card, allowing the linseed oil to leach out, making the paints less greasy to apply. A sharp brush was used to make numerous little dabs of heavily thin paint, and then these were feathered out with a larger soft brush. I used good old tube styrene cement for the struts, in this case on the undercarriage, to allow lots of adjustment time. I also made a simple jig set to the axle wick. Some dirt tones were sprayed lightly on the undersides, where the wheels might throw up mud. Holtzem's aircraft was unique in having individual exhaust stacks as opposed to the standard collective style. These pipes were 3D printed for consistency. The simulated wooden prop was treated as previously described, and then the laminated areas were masked and darkened with transparent brown. Prop logos came from an LF model sheet. It's a 1/72 set, but they look more like 1/48 to me. Now for a final sealing coat of VMS satin varnish. Turn up the air pressure and blast it on thick and wet. It levels beautifully and dries fast and hard. Max's plane had a rear view mirror on the upper wing. The housing was 3D printed, but the mirror itself is a circle of aluminium foil. Rope-covered suspension shock cords were made using embroidery thread, borrowed from my very patient and understanding wife. I can guarantee that this is not an accurate replication of the pattern used and wouldn't withstand the lightest of landings, but I felt it was better to include the detail inaccurately than not at all. Liquid CA glue was brushed over the final knotted mess to keep it in place and flatten any loose fibres. Adding the cabane struts is always stressful, as any slight misalignment here has a compounding effect. I find the jig essential. This one was obtained here in Canada from plasticmodel.ca. Tube glue was again used for the struts, and as you can see it can be quite stringy. I had made a little template from stiff acetate with the wing location holes drilled out, as well as guides for the centerline and wing edges. This enabled me to get the struts positioned exactly and allow them to set before attaching the top wing. Once the interplane struts had been glued in place, an eraser was carefully laid on top to prevent any shifting while the glue cured. I thermoformed an acetate windscreen around a marker of suitable diameter, using hot water. Rigging began by measuring the distance between 2 points and cutting elastic rigging wire to be 2/3 of the actual length. Each end of the wire was glued to a 3D printed loop, then each loop glued into the holes I'd drilled earlier. Because each wire is 2/3 of the actual length, they stretch consistently, so should appear at roughly the same thickness when pulled tight, despite the differing lengths. The rigging material is by Ushi van der Rosten, available in 3 thicknesses. I used the standard size thread. I feel that most aftermarket turnbuckles are overscale when compared with the actual things. Rather than make actual turnbuckles, I chose instead to create a visual impression of them. Using 2 blobs of black CA glue applied to the wire, I created the ends of each turnbuckle. The glue I used was a bit too thin, so I had to go back and do each blob twice. I then very carefully painted between each black blob with bronze acrylic paint. The final addition was the flare rack carried on Max Holtzem's Pfalz. Max survived World War I and became a US citizen, eventually working as a flight inspector on the P-51 Mustang production line during World War II.